They were draining the oldest canal in the city, expecting only mud and rusty garbage. But the former soldier John Smith was the first to sense that beneath this silt lay not just metal. When his shovel struck smooth steel, the city did not yet know that in a few hours, a secret would emerge that the Soviet Union had buried forever. Sometimes the past does not die, it simply waits for someone to dare drain the water. A foggy northern morning spread over the industrial zone. A cold wind carried the smell of rust and water, and the sky over Newtown hung low, as if listening to the ground. The city of Newtown was built around metal and water. Everything started with the canal, narrow, straight, lined with stone back in the Tsarist era, when barges carried coal and steel along it. Back then, it was the artery, the living vein of the city. Now, the canal resembled an old scar, black, stinking, forgotten, overgrown with legends and trash. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the canal became unnecessary. Factories closed, cranes rusted, the water in the canal stood thick and dark like oil. People got used to considering it part of the landscape, unpleasant but constant. Until environmental activists and a few stubborn officials managed to get a decision to drain and clean the canal. Leading the work was assigned to John Smith. John was 46. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with the heavy gait of someone accustomed to carrying gear. His face was angular, with sharp cheekbones and deeply set gray eyes. Stubble always appeared by evening, giving him the look of a tired wolf. His left eyebrow was split by an old scar from a shrapnel wound received many years ago. John rarely smiled, and when he did, the smile looked unfamiliar, like a forgotten muscle. He was a former sapper who had been through Chechnya. There, he learned the main thing. Trust not words, but the ground under your feet. And also, never relax, even when it seems the danger is behind. The war left in him not screams or fear, but emptiness, cold, neatly folded inside like personal gear. John did not drink, did not shout, did not complain, he simply did the job. That was why he was valued. On the site, John held himself calmly and detached. With the workers, he was laconic but fair. If someone slacked off, he did not yell but looked. That look was usually enough. Most of the workers were temporary. Men in worn jackets with rough hands and quick interest in pay. History did not concern them. They needed the end of the shift and money. Among them stood out Robert Johnson, the excavator foreman, a stocky man in his 50s with a red face and thick mustache. Robert loved to joke, especially about the damned canal, and believed that below there was nothing but junk. The water is gone, and thank God, he said. The rest is not our business. On the first day, the pumps started at full power. The water slowly receded, exposing the bottom. With each hour, the air became heavier. From under the silt rose the smell of old metal, fuel oil, rotting algae, thick, intrusive, as if the city's past had suddenly decided to remind itself. John stood at the edge of the canal and looked down. He felt a strange tension, familiar from the war. Not fear, more like anticipation, like before a sapper finds something that should not be there. When the silt began to crack and settle, the first objects appeared. Rusty bicycles, fragments of crates, pieces of rebar. The workers chatted, laughed, threw cigarette butts down. For them, it was just the bottom. For John, no. He noticed details, 2 even lines under the layer of dirt, strange shapes that did not resemble random trash. His gaze caught everything that looked too orderly. The war had taught him. Chaos is rarely real chaos. By evening, the water level had dropped enough to go down. John walked along the bottom of the canal, stepping heavily through the viscous silt. His boots sank in. Each step required effort. He bent down, picked up a piece of rusty metal. It was heavy but processed, not random. "Something's not right here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Robert just snorted. "You see war everywhere, John." But John did not answer. He felt that inner tension again, the quiet signal that had once saved his life. That night, returning to his small apartment on the outskirts of Newtown, John could not sleep for a long time. The city outside the window was quiet, only occasionally the wind howled between the panel buildings. When sleep finally came, it was heavy. John dreamed he was underground again. Dark, cold. He hears dull clangs of metal on metal, slow, rhythmic, as if someone is knocking from inside. He walks toward the sound, knowing he should not but unable to stop. The ground under his feet trembles. And suddenly, silence. He woke up abruptly, with the feeling that someone was watching him from the depths. John sat up in bed and realized. This canal is not just a dirty ditch. It's not dead. It's waiting. The morning over the canal was gray and quiet, as if the city itself held its breath. By the time the sun barely broke through the low clouds, the bottom of the canal was almost fully exposed. The silt had dried in uneven patches, and among it, outlines of objects began to emerge. First timidly, then bolder, as if someone was slowly lifting the curtain over a long-forgotten scene. The workers first noticed old bicycles. The frames were twisted, chains rusted solid, wheels flattened as if heavy trucks had once driven over them. Then broken safes appeared. Their doors were ripped off, locks smashed with brute force. A little further, crates with tools, fragments of radio stations, coils of wire tangled in dirty knots. The workers perked up. Someone whistled, someone laughed. "So that's where everything disappeared to," Robert Johnson tossed, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Half the city dumped stuff here." But John Smith did not laugh. He stood at the edge of the canal, head slightly tilted, and looked down attentively. His gaze immediately picked out what others missed. Old rifles, partially disassembled, helmets with peeling green paint, and mainly, metal badges with a red star, covered in rust but still recognizable. Some items had clear inventory numbers stamped to military standards. John squatted, picked up one of the tags, and ran his finger over it. "Military," he said quietly. "Not civilian." Robert shrugged. "Yeah, who knows what they threw in here." But John felt a cold wariness growing inside. He had seen similar things before, in Chechnya, in places where they tried to erase traces, where things spoke more than people. By noon, the conversations among the workers grew quieter, and the jokes rougher. Rumors started. Someone remembered his grandfather talking about night trucks by the canal. Someone said the word KGB, and it hung in the air like a heavy echo. "They say they brought here what shouldn't exist," whispered young worker Alex Turner. A skinny guy in his 20s with a pale face and nervous movements. "Documents, weapons, people." John turned sharply. "People? Just rumors." Alex lowered his eyes. John did not continue. He knew if a person is afraid to speak, he's afraid for a reason. By evening, He went down into the canal himself. Slowly, methodically, like he once surveyed minefields. He began to notice a strange thing. The items lay in groups. In one place only equipment, in another, weapons. A little further, personal items. Boots, belts, flasks, even a child's toy with its head torn off. This was not chaotic trash, it was unloaded. John straightened up and looked along the canal. The lines of the groups noticeably repeated each other, as if someone at different times dumped the same contents in the same spots. His sapper instinct told him. That's how they do it when following instructions. At sunset, an elderly woman approached the canal fence. Her name was Mary Thompson. Short, thin, with gray hair neatly gathered in a bun. Her face was wrinkled, skin thin and almost transparent. She leaned on a cane, but her gaze remained sharp and alive. "Are you in charge here?" she asked John. "Yes." Mary Thompson looked long at the bottom of the canal, then said quietly, "In the 70s, you couldn't come near here. Military stood with rifles, passes. We thought it was exercises, and then everything disappeared." John listened attentively, without interrupting. Then they deepened the canal, filled it with water, and said, "Forget." She looked at him as if checking if he could be trusted. But the earth doesn't forget much. Later, John requested the city archives. The response was short and strange. Documentation for 1972 to 1978 is absent. Not lost, not damaged. Absent. That night, John went down into the canal again. He went where the silt was darkest and densest, where the water lingered longest. He dropped to his knees and began clearing the mud with his hands. And suddenly, his fingers hit something hard, not stone, not metal from trash. The surface was smooth and cold. John froze. He cleared a little more and saw a thin, almost perfect crack going deeper. It was too even to be random. John exhaled slowly. The canal was not a dump, it was a lid. And someone long ago wanted it never to be opened. John Smith went down into the canal before dawn, when the air was dense and cold, and the city slept as if unwilling to see what was opening beneath it. Formally, he was ordered to wait for heavy equipment and engineers, but John knew too well when a sapper's intuition says now, waiting means missing the moment. He put on an old jacket, worn with a patched elbow, and checked his gloves. Hands must always feel the ground. The bottom of the canal was quiet. No voices, no steps, only the faint creak of silt under boots and the rare splash of residual water. John walked slowly, counting steps, as if he were not on a civilian site but in a danger zone. His posture was straight, shoulders tense, his body remembered what the mind preferred to forget. He dropped to his knees where he had noticed the strange line the day before, removed a glove, and plunged his palm into the cold mud. The silt was dense, heavy, as if tamped down for years. John carefully cleared the surface, not rushing, and then his fingers touched smooth metal. He froze. The surface was even, without corrosion traces, cold and alien. This was not like a fragment or discarded mechanism. John ran his palm further. The metal continued. Inside, something clicked. That same feeling he had experienced many years ago, standing before the entrance to an underground shelter in the Chechen mountains. Then too, everything looked abandoned, and then too, it seemed no one was inside. He inhaled slowly. A familiar pressure arose in his chest, as if memory decided to surface before the silt. Before his eyes, war scenes flashed for a moment. A narrow concrete corridor, yellow lamplight, a heavy metal door behind which could be people or death. He remembered the sound of his own steps and how his fingers trembled despite years of training. John blinked and returned to the present. He cleared the surface a few more centimeters and noticed engraving traces, erased, barely distinguishable. John leaned closer, squinted, his fingers traced the letters themselves. Object 17. He did not say it aloud. Not because he was afraid, but because such words do not like noise. A number, not a name, not a warning, just a designation. That's how they mark what is not meant for discussion. John straightened up and looked around. The canal was empty. Only him and the metal hidden under the ground. Fragments of rumors he had heard in the army floated in his head, about underground complexes built at the height of the Cold War, about places not on maps but existing deeper than any memory. He knew one thing. If this was really a military object, it was not built in haste and not abandoned just like that. Returning to the surface, John met Thomas Reed, a representative of the city administration. Thomas was a man in his 50s, neat, with a round face and receding hairline. He always wore a clean jacket and spoke in a soft, cautious voice of someone accustomed to skirting sharp corners. "Well, John, found anything interesting?" he asked, trying to look casual. John looked at him attentively. "Old metal, junk, nothing special." He lied easily, without strain. Not because he wanted to hide the find forever, but because he understood. Now is not the time. Too soon, too many extra eyes. Thomas nodded and left, satisfied with the superficial answer. That night, John returned. He came alone, with a flashlight and tape measure. The city lights illuminated only the edges of the canal, leaving the bottom in half-darkness. John moved confidently, as if he knew the way in advance. He dropped to his knees again and began measuring. The metal surface went deeper. It was not just lying under the silt, it was part of a structure. John tapped the ground around. The sound changed, dull, then more resonant. Voids. Space, not accident. He made a few notes in an old army notebook with a faded cover. Such notebooks record only what is important. The more he measured, the clearer it became. The object was actively camouflaged. Silt, trash, water. All this was not a random consequence of time. It was done deliberately, layer by layer, over decades. John sat right on the cold ground and lowered his head. He felt not fear, but heavy realization. If the object was really military, it was not closed, it was left as if it might still be needed. He recalled Mary Thompson's words. The earth doesn't forget. Now he knew the metal doesn't either. Before leaving, John ran his palm over the smooth surface one more time. "I found you," he said quietly, "but stay silent for now." He climbed up without looking back. Ahead were too many questions and not a single safe answer. If a military object was hidden under the canal, then Newtown's history was much deeper and darker than it seemed. And if this object was not closed, someone once expected it to be opened again. The work in the canal continued for the 6th day, and the earth seemed to start resisting. John Smith deliberately slowed the pace. He refused heavy equipment in one specific sector, citing the risk of collapse. Officially, concern for safety. In reality, the desire to reach the hidden layer by hand, as taught in the army, do not trust what you have not felt yourself. With him worked two men. Michael Harris, a stocky man of 40 with short-cropped dark hair and a heavy chin. A former miner who survived a collapse, after which he became silent and cautious. He rarely asked questions and knew how to dig slowly, without fuss. The second, David Wilson, lean, wiry, in his 30s, with an eternal cigarette in his teeth and attentive, keen eyes. David was one of those people who see a lot and say little. A habit developed from years of odd jobs and unnecessary talks with the wrong people. They dug by hand, layer by layer, removing silt, clay, stones. With each day, the air became drier and colder, as if breath from another time slowly emerged from underground. And then one day, Michael's shovel hit not earth. The sound was dull, heavy, too regular. John understood immediately. He approached, squatted, ran his palm over the cleared surface. Before them appeared the edge of a steel plate. Not a fragment, not a hatch. This was part of a hole. They worked silently for several more hours. When the silt was fully removed, it became clear. Before them was a door. It was wide, massive, recessed in concrete. The steel had darkened with time but not rusted. Thickness no less than 30 centimeters. Along the edges, traces of sealing typical for military shelters. No handles, only a mechanical lock and an old, faded warning sign. John felt everything inside tighten. He had seen such doors before, in other places, in other lives. "This isn't civilian," Michael said quietly. "I know," John replied. They understood each other without extra words. In no city plan, in no archive John had managed to review, was there even a hint of such a structure. No mark, no signature. As if someone had neatly cut this fragment from reality. John took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves. His movements became precise, almost ritual. He pulled old tools from his bag. Not new, but proven military ones. Those with which he once opened doors behind which could be life or death. The mechanical lock was complex but familiar. Soviet engineering did not tolerate elegance, only reliability. John worked slowly, listening to each click, each resistance of the metal. His head was empty. In such moments, he always felt a strange calm, as if returning to where everything was clear. David shifted nervously from foot to foot. "If there's," he started and fell silent. "If there's something there," John interrupted, "we're already too far to pretend we didn't see." The click sounded unexpectedly loud. The door yielded not immediately. It resisted, as if checking if the one standing before it was worthy. Then came a dull creak, and the steel plate slowly moved inward. From the darkness burst cold, dry air. It smelled of concrete, dust, and something old, not rot, but time. Like in rooms where there have been no people for years, but their presence is still felt. Michael involuntarily stepped back. David stubbed out his cigarette and shoved it in his pocket, forgetting the habit. Behind the door opened a stairwell. Concrete steps descended at a sharp angle, losing themselves in the darkness. The walls were even, without cracks, as if finished yesterday. On the right side, slightly above eye level, was an inscription in red paint, faded, peeling, but still readable. "Do not return." John read it silently. His throat went dry. He recalled similar inscriptions from the past. Those written in haste, not for beauty, but for those who should understand at once. Such words did not scare. They warned. John turned on the flashlight. The beam slid over the steps, highlighting dust settled in an even layer. No one had walked here for a long time, but that did not mean the place was forgotten. "I'll go first," he said. It was not an order, but a fact. Michael and David did not argue. They knew if something went wrong, it was John who should be ahead. He was the one who knew how to take the first hit. John placed his foot on the first step. The concrete was dry and solid. He took another step. And another. With each meter down, the city remained further behind. Noise, light, air, all disappeared, as if erased. Only the stairs remained, the cold flashlight beam, and the feeling that he was descending not just underground, but into a past that had waited too long above. John did not look back. He knew no one here planned to go back. The stairs ended unexpectedly, as if someone cut off the path mid-sentence. John Smith stepped first onto the even concrete floor and stopped. The flashlight beam slid forward and hit not a wall, but space. Before him opened a corridor, wide and high, with even vaults and neat cable channels along the walls. The air here was dry, still, as if sealed decades ago and forgotten to open. Michael Harris descended next, cautiously, with a miner's habit of first checking if the floor holds. His face, usually calm and stone-like, changed for a moment. Eyebrows furrowed, lips parted. "Damn!" He exhaled. "This isn't a basement." David Wilson brought up the rear. He held the flashlight lower, illuminating the floor and walls, as if fearing not the ceiling, but what might lie underfoot. His lean face looked tense, eyes darted. David was not a coward, but he knew how to feel boundaries. And here, boundaries were erased. They had gone further. The corridor led into a huge room, so spacious that the flashlight beams lost themselves in the darkness. The ceiling was supported by massive concrete columns placed with engineering precision. It really resembled a small city hidden under another city, with its streets, intersections, and silence. On the floor stood wooden crates, neatly stacked in rows. The boards had darkened with time, but the seals on them were still readable. John approached closer, ran his finger over the faded stamp. Military Warehouse Code, old, very old. In the neighboring room, they found metal cabinets with documents. Folders were laid out neatly, pedantically. The paper had yellowed, but the ink held. David opened one folder. Inside were diagrams, lists, signatures without surnames, only positions. "They prepared everything here," Michael said quietly, as if waiting. Further was the communications hall. Old radio transmitters, consoles with faded bulbs, telephones with heavy handsets. John turned the flashlight brighter and saw that some devices still had seals. They were not used, they were stored. In one warehouse, Michael flipped open a crate lid and froze. Inside stood bottles, even rows, glass murky from dust, but contents clear, amber, dark. Labels neatly pasted and bearing dates. 1964, 1969, 1973. "Vodka," David muttered. "And wine." John took one bottle in his hands. The glass was cold, heavy. This was not contraband or trophy. This was provision for someone who was supposed to live here long. The further they went, the stronger the feeling changed. This place stopped being a warehouse and became a home that never happened. In one side room, John stopped. There stood beds, simple metal ones with neatly folded mattresses. Nearby, nightstands. On one lay a photograph, black and white. A woman in her 30s, fair-haired with a soft gaze, holding a small boy in her arms. The photo was slightly bent, as if often held in the palm. Nearby, a letter. Envelope without stamp, addressee only a name. John did not read it, he understood anyway. Further was the dining hall. Long tables, benches, dishes in crates, all clean, all ready. Even a kitchen with stoves, ventilation, supplies. And finally, the medical block. White tiles, cabinets with instruments, stretchers. Not for battlefield wounded, for people who were supposed to live here and get sick. This isn't a bunker, David said hoarsely. This is waiting. John nodded. Inside him, something slowly settled, like silt after draining water. He began to see the whole picture. This place was not prepared for a strike, it was prepared for the last order. A supply center. A node, a place where the chosen were supposed to descend, engineers, specialists, families, if the world above ceased to exist. But the order never came. The Cold War ended differently, without a signal, without sirens. And these people remained above. And underground remained their life, laid out in crates. John felt a strange, heavy emptiness. He had seen warehouses and shelters before, but never like this. There was no weapon here. There was hope, neatly packed and forgotten. Michael silently sat on the edge of a bed, clenched his hands. His mining past taught him to work with earth, but not with such knowledge. Underfoot was not a seam, but a layer of human fates. They waited, he said finally, and didn't wait. John turned off the flashlight for a moment. In the darkness, this place seemed to breathe. He understood. This is not a hideout, this is a monument, invisible, unplanned, but real. He turned the light back on. Let's go further, he said. We must see everything. And somewhere deep inside, he knew after this, he would descend underground as a different man. The truth rose to the surface not immediately, but as everything dangerous does. Slowly, inexorably, and loudly. First, the workers talked about the find under the canal, then the city. Then the first journalists from the regional center appeared. Cameras, microphones, people with notebooks. Newtown, accustomed to being gray and unnoticed, suddenly found itself in the center of attention. The canal, which for decades stank of silt and oblivion, became the entrance to a past from which one could no longer turn away. When historians arrived in the city, it became clear. Hiding was no longer possible. One of the first was Elizabeth Carter. A woman around 40, tall, slender, with a straight back and short dark blonde hair. She had an attentive face and the habit of being silent for a long time before asking a question. She specialized in closed objects of the late USSR and knew too well what lies look like in official formulations. This isn't amateur work, she said, descending underground for the first time. This is a state project. Behind her came foreign correspondents. English, German, French speech echoed through corridors where there had been only silence before. For the first time in decades, these walls heard voices again. Under public pressure, the authorities were forced to admit. Under Newtown, there really was a secret object from the USSR era, not entered in any civilian register. The formulations were cautious, dry, verified to the comma, but the essence could no longer be hidden. Documents began to surface one after another. Not in city archives, there everything was still empty, but in departmental storages where they did not let in even with permissions before. Folders with classifications, faded diagrams, typewritten lists. John Smith was present at the first review. He was invited as a consultant. Formally, due to experience. Informally, because he was the one who opened the door no one planned to open. John sat at a long table, arms folded, and listened silently. His angular face remained calm, but inside everything was tense. He felt not like a hero, but a witness. From the documents, it followed. The object under the canal was a protection center for the industrial elite. Engineers, designers, energy workers, their families, those without whom the country could not recover after a nuclear strike. If the signal came, they were supposed to descend underground and wait out the end of the world. But there was no signal. The Cold War ended with collapse, not explosion. Orders were not cancelled, they simply stopped being given. The people on the lists continued ordinary lives, not knowing that under the city, another world was long ready for them. And then the canal was built, a new line, a new project. Water, silt, oblivion. All neatly according to instructions, not destroy, but hide. John was handed one of the folders. Look, the official said, not meeting his eyes. Inside was a list. Names, birth dates, specialties, brief notes. John read slowly. His fingers trembled slightly, but he did not stop. He checked several surnames, then more. Not a single living one. Someone died in the 90s, someone from illness, someone from old age. Several in strange circumstances that no one investigated anymore. John closed the folder. A lump stood in his throat. He suddenly understood why this place made such an impression on him. Because this was a bunker without the saved, a place created for a future that never came, and for people who never knew they were chosen. Elizabeth Carter approached him later. It's hard for you. John shrugged. I've seen abandoned positions, but I've never seen abandoned fates. He descended underground one more time, alone, without cameras, without experts, just walked through the corridors that everyone now knew. He looked at the beds, the dining hall, the medical cabinets, and thought that sometimes the state knows how to prepare for the worst but does not know how to live with the best. History, he understood, was not buried. It was set aside. It waited for the moment when someone would dare drain the water again and look down. When John came out, the canal was almost cleaned. The sun reflected on the wet concrete. The city lived its life. But now he knew. Under every step hides more than it seems. And perhaps this knowledge was more important than any secret. Spring in Newtown came quietly, without fanfare. The water returned to the canal slowly, cautiously, as if checking if it could flow this course again. Now the banks were reinforced, the concrete cleaned, and along the water appeared new railings and benches. People stopped, looked at the sky's reflection, and spoke in half voices. The canal was no longer the city's stinking wound. It became a sign, a reminder that even the most forgotten place can gain a second meaning. Underground, behind the massive door, Object 17 was officially recognized as a historical complex. workers were replaced by restorers. The harsh light of construction lamps gave way to soft illumination. Plaques with dates and explanations were neatly fixed on the walls. This place was no longer hidden, it was taught to be understood. John Smith came there rarely. He saw how the space changed and felt his role was complete. When he was offered to stay as a consultant, caretaker, face of the project, he refused without loud words, without explanations. Simply said, "I did what I had to." John did not like attention. He never wore a uniform after the army and did not talk about the war. His angular face, still bearing traces of lived years and old decisions, did not change. The same stubble, the same calm gaze. But inside, he became lighter, as if he had removed a heavy backpack he had carried too long. On the last day at the object, he descended underground one time. The last. He walked through the corridors slowly, without a flashlight, using the new light, stopped at the beds, the dining hall, the medical block. He no longer felt that oppressive emptiness. In its place came another feeling, acceptance. The people for whom this place was built were not saved, but neither were they erased. Their names were now known, their stories studied, their waiting ceased to be nameless. Above, the city learned to live differently. In schools, they told about the canal not as a dirty ditch, but as part of history. The elderly stopped averting their eyes when talk turned to the 70s. The youth asked questions. And for the first time in a long time, Newtown did not pretend the past did not exist. John left the job quietly. There was no farewell meeting, only a handshake from Robert Johnson and a short nod from Michael Harris. David Wilson, still lean and silent, handed him a pack of cigarettes. "For memory," he said. John did not smoke but took it. In the evening, he walked long along the canal. The water softly splashed against the banks. In the reflection of the lanterns, it seemed alive, moving, clean. John stopped and looked at the flow. He understood. They had brought to light not only concrete and steel. They had raised memory. As a soldier, he was accustomed to completing tasks. This was the last, not combat, but perhaps the most important. He no longer felt that something remained unfinished. The city no longer hid its shadow, and the canal carried water again. Not silt, but truth. John turned and went home without looking back. Some things do not require farewell. It is enough that they are no longer hidden. Sometimes it seems that everything important in our life is long buried. Under the ground, under pain, under years of silence. But God arranged this world so that truth does not know how to disappear forever. It waits for its hour, its person, its small miracle. The canal was drained by human hands, but what opened beneath it was allowed from above, because nothing comes to light without God's will. In our daily life, the same happens. We hide wounds, postpone conversations, bury hopes, and God patiently waits for us to dare drain the fear and look deeper, where healing begins. If this story touched your heart, if you felt it speaks about your life too, share it, write comments, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories. May the Lord bless everyone who watches this video. May He give you light where there has been darkness for a long time, and strength to see what can no longer be hidden.